Imagine discovering a plant so valuable that it rewrites trade routes, reshapes empires, and turns small islands into global power centers. Not oil. Not gold. A crop. Something that grows in dirt. This has happened repeatedly in history, and every time it followed the same pattern. A single crop becomes indispensable. Demand explodes faster than supply can respond, and entire nations reorganize their economies around one fragile source of wealth. At first, it looks like a miracle. Then it becomes a trap. This is the story of how single crops made nations rich, powerful, and influential, and how that same success often planted the seeds of collapse. To understand this pattern, you have to forget modern diversification logic. In pre-industrial economies, growth didn't come from balanced portfolios or productivity software. It came from control. Control of land, control of labor, control of trade routes, and above all, control of something everyone else needed. The moment a crop crosses that threshold, from food to necessity to addiction, it stops being agriculture and starts being economics. Sugar is the cleanest example. Before the 1500s, sugar was a luxury item in Europe. It was used as medicine, spice, and status symbol. Most people lived their entire lives without tasting it. European elites developed a taste for sweetness, and sugar shifted from novelty to obsession. Once tea, coffee, and chocolate entered European diets, sugar stopped being optional. It became embedded in daily life. That shift changed everything. Sugarcane thrives in tropical climates. Europe didn't have them. Colonies did. Small Caribbean islands that were economically irrelevant suddenly became some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. Barbados. Jamaica. Saint Domingue. Cuba. These weren't diversified economies. They were sugar machines. Plantations replaced forests. Entire islands reorganized around one output. Capital poured in. Ports expanded. Ships multiplied. Insurance markets developed. Credit systems evolved. London banks grew rich financing sugar shipments. For Britain and France, sugar was more profitable than gold. By the late 1700s, sugar made up a massive share of European trade revenue. Saint Domingue alone produced nearly half the world's sugar and coffee. It was the crown jewel of the French Empire. This is where the economic trap forms. Sugar was labor-intensive, crushingly so, and plantation owners needed cheap, controllable labor to keep costs down. That demand helped fuel the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't incidental. It was structural. Sugar profits required scale. Scale required labor. Labor was forcibly imported. Human beings became economic inputs. The wealth generated was staggering. European ports flourished. Merchant classes expanded. Governments collected taxes. Naval power increased. For the metropole, sugar meant prosperity. For the producing regions, it meant monoculture dependence. Everything depended on sugar prices staying high and trade routes staying open. That dependency made these economies incredibly rich and incredibly fragile at the same time. The moment something disrupted the system, rebellion, war, disease, price competition, the entire economic structure cracked. Saint Domingue learned this brutally. When enslaved workers revolted in 1791, the sugar economy collapsed almost overnight. France lost its most profitable colony. Global sugar markets were thrown into chaos. Napoleon, starved of colonial revenue, sold Louisiana to the United States to fund European wars. One crop reshaped global borders. But sugar wasn't unique. Cotton followed the same script. In the 19th century, industrialization in Britain created an insatiable demand for raw cotton. Textile mills needed steady supply, and the American South delivered it. Cotton wasn't just a crop. It was the backbone of global industrial capitalism. By the mid-1800s, cotton made up over half of all U.S. exports. Southern states grew wealthy not because they industrialized, but because they controlled land, labor, and access to a critical input. Britain depended on American cotton so heavily that Southern politicians believed it made them untouchable. They called it King Cotton diplomacy. They were half right. When the American Civil War broke out, cotton exports collapsed. British factories slowed. Workers lost jobs. Markets panicked. But here's the key economic lesson. Britain adapted. India, Egypt, and other regions ramped up cotton production. Supply chains reconfigured. Once alternatives existed, American cotton lost its leverage. The South, however, couldn't adapt. Its economy was too concentrated. Capital was locked into land and slaves. Infrastructure was built for one output. When slavery ended and cotton prices fell, the region stagnated for generations. Wealth built on a single crop evaporated. Rubber is another case, and even more extreme. In the late 1800s, rubber became essential for industrial economies. Tires, belts, hoses, insulation. Without rubber, modern machinery doesn't function. At first, rubber came almost entirely from the Amazon. Brazil experienced a rubber boom so intense that cities like Manaus built opera houses in the jungle. Fortunes were made overnight. Rubber barons lived like royalty. Again, a miracle. Again, a trap. Rubber trees grew wild in the Amazon, but cultivation was difficult. Disease limited plantations. Supply remained geographically constrained. Then the British smuggled rubber seeds out of Brazil and planted them in Southeast Asia. There, plantations flourished. Suddenly, global supply exploded. Prices collapsed. Brazil's rubber economy imploded almost overnight. Manaus went from opulence to decay in a single generation. This pattern repeats because the underlying economics are always the same. A single crop economy benefits from early scarcity and first mover advantage. High prices attract capital. Wealth accumulates rapidly. Political power follows. But monocultures lack resilience. They are vulnerable to substitution, disease, climate shocks, technological change, and geopolitical disruption. And most importantly, they train institutions around one assumption: that demand will always be there. History shows it rarely is. Bananas follow the same path. Central American economies reorganized around banana exports for American consumers. Infrastructure was built to move fruit, not people. Political systems bent around corporate interests. The term banana republic exists for a reason. When disease, competition, or political instability hit, these economies had little else to fall back on. We see the same story with coffee, cocoa, tea, spices, tobacco. Single crops can create explosive growth. They can lift nations onto the global stage, but they also compress economic complexity. When everything revolves around one output, innovation slows. Education narrows. Capital allocation becomes distorted. Short-term wealth replaces long-term resilience. This isn't just history. It's an economic warning that keeps repeating. Modern economies don't rely on crops the same way, but they rely on commodities, technologies, and supply chains with similar characteristics. Oil states experience the same boom and bust cycle as sugar islands. Semiconductor hubs face the same concentration risk as cotton regions. Rare earth producers today sit exactly where sugar producers once stood, early, indispensable, and dangerously exposed. The fundamental principle is this: wealth generated by scarcity creates power. Power invites dependence. Dependence creates fragility. Single crop economies often become politically rigid. Elites protect the status quo. Diversification is seen as unnecessary or threatening. By the time diversification becomes urgent, it's often too late. This is why nations that escape the trap intentionally diversified early. The Netherlands used sugar profits to build finance and shipping. Britain reinvested colonial wealth into industrial capacity. The United States transitioned from cotton exports to manufacturing dominance. The difference wasn't morality or foresight. It was reinvestment into complexity. Economies that stayed simple collapsed. Those that layered new systems on top survived. There's also a human cost to single crop wealth. Labor exploitation isn't accidental. It's economically incentivized. When margins depend on scale and prices are volatile, producers cut cost wherever possible. That almost always means labor. From slavery to debt peonage to migrant labor, the pattern holds. High profits at the center require pressure at the edges. Environmental damage follows the same logic. Monocultures exhaust soil. They destroy biodiversity. They increase vulnerability to disease. Short-term output rises. Long-term sustainability collapses. Every empire built on a single crop faced this reckoning. Some adapted. Most didn't. The biggest illusion single crop wealth creates is permanence. When money flows easily, it feels structural, but it's conditional. Change one variable, technology, taste, trade routes, politics, and the system unravels. The nations that learned this lesson early invested in institutions, education, and diversified production. The ones that didn't became footnotes. Today, when we talk about economic resilience, we're really talking about the opposite of monoculture: diversity of production, diversity of trade partners, diversity of skills. History shows us that the fastest way to get rich is also often the fastest way to collapse. Sugar, cotton, rubber, bananas, coffee, different crops. Same story. A single input can lift a nation. It can also hollow it out. The lesson isn't to avoid specialization entirely. It's to understand its limits. Specialization creates growth. Diversification creates survival. Every modern economy flirting with dependence on one export, one technology, one resource, is replaying this script. The question is whether they'll recognize it before the cycle completes. History doesn't repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because incentives don't change. And incentives always reward speed before stability. That's how a single crop can make a nation rich. And that's how it can quietly make it vulnerable.